All right.
I think it started now.
Yep. Great.
Okay.
Thanks for doing that. It's a pleasure to meet everybody. I've heard so many wonderful things about this team and have seen some of the work that you've been doing. So it's a pleasure to be part of this experience. And I really hope it is an experience. I do have a PowerPoint that I'd like to start sharing in just a minute. But just as a personal piece, I've been working with the International Red Cross in terms of the Federation since about 2007. And so it's been a good number of years, and I've spent most of my time with, sort of what we would say was traditional first aid, sort of more on the physical side of things. But I'm also a professional. I'm a firefighter, EMS type of person. And, I spend a lot of time in disaster situations, both on the academic, looking at that, but also actually being a practitioner and just recognizing the idea of trauma on specifically my colleagues, but the people that we're trying to serve, and then the larger communities is just, for the last 10 years, grown and grown and grown. And we started talking about psychological first aid, I think around 2006 in the American Red Cross, as a formal type of education. And so it's been in my mindset for a long time, but we started the journal back in 2017, so the International Journal of First Aid Education. And we did not want to isolate it. We never said it had to be physical about bleeding or CPR or something like that. We've always wanted to be more on this holistic side of support, from when an acute injury happens or an exacerbation of a chronic issue. Like, what can people do to support each other? And it's always about this idea of resiliency, because we can get to surviving, but surviving is not enough. Like, we actually need to get people to a point where they can again contribute to their own lives and contribute to the lives of other people. And we can use first aid as that at least first part of this chain of survival behaviors, which I'll get into in just a minute. So I'm excited to have this conversation. From what I hear, you're working with countries and programs that are taking on this from a really practical perspective, and that we're trying to unify these ideas so that we can share them with others. And so we developed this idea of around a pitch. And so I want to just share my my screen here, if I can get this to work out. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But this idea of a pitch, and I'm American, a couple other people in the room have some American experiences. So baseball, this idea of throwing something out, and sometimes it's in the strike zone and it's perfect and it's hittable and we can hit a home run with it. Sometimes that pitch is off a little bit and we might hit, a little bit shorter, or we might swing and we miss. So, but it's all about the pitch. If we don't ever throw that ball to the batter, people don't get a chance to learn. They don't get a chance to do. They don't get a chance to practice. And so I wanted to throw that metaphor out there. And what I was hoping for, and I'm not sure when you received this idea last week or a little bit earlier, but we were really hoping that you would have some pitches for us today. And so as I was thinking about this project or this presentation, and I'm not sure why I'm not moving along, but I was hoping that you would throw some pitches out for us today so that we could sort of workshop them and have a chance to maybe get those pitches a little bit more in that strike zone, so that when you start to write or want to contribute it, it'll be a home run when we get it out there. So for today, and I'm thinking we have about 4 hours, right? Go ahead.
4?
That was a joke.
Oh.
That was a joke.
I'm not computing at all.
Sorry, that's right. You're coming off
No,
the
no,
fever.
no.
So
Absolutely, yeah.
no. Hopefully in the next 50 minutes or so, we'll get through this. So so yeah, so we'll talk about some goals, we'll talk about some opportunities, some manuscript development, how does the submission process work for our journal, and then we'll talk about some of those pitches hopefully in between if you have some ready to go. So Daniel, you're welcome to jump in at any time, and if I forget, just grab me. So part of our goals for this project was to have a special issue of the journal that was dedicated to sort of priming the pump, right, to get people acknowledging and using and implementing and studying psychosocial support, mental health first aid, that sort of larger umbrella. And so this workshop is to ideally inspire your work that's going to be of quality so that other people can learn from it. I'd like to be able to answer your questions about the processes of publishing in the International Journal of First Aid Education. And I'm really hoping that we build a relationship that it starts today with the technical advisors and the journal, so that it's not something that's just one special issue, but something that we have a continual representation of mental health support and psychosocial support in the journal itself. Does anybody have any other things that they really need to have answered or want to talk about today? So that sounds good. All right.
Many things.
So I want to start here. When we think about first aid, we look at it from this idea of there's a larger system that supports first aid, and those are the guidelines that are out there. We have sort of mores and norms and different cultures that talk about how you help people or maybe don't help people. And so there's this macro system, and then as you get closer to the individual, you have this exosystem, which is sort of the laws of the land, policies that might be part of a national society even, which help focus those norms or, in the larger culture. And then we have this microsystem that surrounds individuals, whether those are teachers or counselors or first aiders that help the individual. And then we actually have the individual who is like impacted by an event. And so we see resiliency that's built up and down this, and the more unified the systems are, the stronger impact it has on the individual, and vice versa. So those are this is an organizing concept of social ecological model people might know about from their studies. Bronfenbrenner. Does this ring true for anybody? So this is Yuri Bronfenbrenner's sort of social ecological model. I do see somebody has a hand up, and I'm happy to hear who that is, but I can't see.
So Jeffrey, I'm having through Guled my hand up. So just to answer your question, I'm a little bit slow, and we are always a little bit behind. So probably my question for this. So we're struggling. I mean, just before this call, I was sitting with our colleague here discussing, different well-being measures, tools for that we are using in humanitarian settings, right? And this is somehow applicable, somehow not. And it's the difficulties of using these standardized tools through our humanitarian intervention, and then kind of blocking us from really showcasing the work that we're doing and abiding by the standards of science, if I can say, in humanities. Sorry, but I'm very curious to see different insights, on how can we still prove the scientificity of our work, our logic, and our interventions, and yet using these quantitative tools or other types of things that we can do. So if I studied clinical psychology, right, and so the research was very much bound to peer-reviewed quantitative measures, if I can say, and I'm talking about 10, 15 years where the peak of discussions around these tools was happening, and I'm happy to see that there's a shift nowadays into more anthropological, sociological insights, and I'm very happy to hear this through you, this webinar, and the discussions that you're having.
Yeah, and so that's the nice part about our journal, is that there are multiple ways of sharing, right, the work that's being done. And so hopefully throughout the presentation, we can talk a little bit more specifically. But again, when that inverted triangle that I just showed you, when you look at institutional, like you could do policy analysis and see how policies have changed over time, or what needs to change and who's going to change it, which is very different than a clinical psychologist who's looking at the individual and the change of attitude, right?
Yeah.
And so when you look at the exosystem, you could look at how institutions have, prepared staff, how they've organized materials, what theoretical lenses that they're doing. So you can use that sociological or anthropological mindset in those levels. And again, as you're thinking about social network theory or any of those types of pieces at that microsystem level, there's lots of great opportunities to share the experience and the outcomes. But what's also important is how do we apply that going forward? So it's not just what did we do in the past, but really what does it mean for the future? So ultimately that's scholarship. And so we can write reports about things that have happened in the field, but that's all they are reports. But when we put that theoretical lens to it, we make it bigger than just that event or that experience that other people can learn from. So hopefully we'll continue to talk about that. Any other comments or questions?
I did have my hand raised, but I might draw back because you just said we're going to continue and we'll get through it. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so I'm just going to try to share again. So I believe you all work with a triangle also. I think that was shared with me, and you put the individual at the top so that the individual provider of psychosocial support, and then the center has had a focus on that community level and where do you build those resources in that ultimately support the individual. Do I have that right? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, community to specialized. Is the individual specialized?
There's always a focus on the individual, and this is the challenge and the confusion that you're having. So even at the level that you call community level, the measures are still used at an individual measures. So we were exactly talking about this just before we started this webinar, and how disturbing and confusing it is, right? to use. I mean, we can debate this through long. Yeah.
Yes, and it's always based on the perspective of the individual, even the measure of social support, perceived social support, or
subjective.
The social inventory zone is still from that perspective, and is not with the lens of a systematic and how the system works, and we don't capture this.
Okay. Yeah. And so I don't think we have to define everything specifically today, but as we're thinking about it, I don't want you to think that, our approach with the different systems and your approach are totally off base.
Oh,
If you look at this model and you think about them as circles, whether you start at the top and work down or you work it from the middle and you go up, we're still talking about these levels of support, and we're talking about opportunities to influence. And that's where these arrows are important. That, there's influence coming in the circle and coming out of the circles. And the more we know about those relationships, the stronger we are probably at creating policy or helping people create good practices. And if we look at those relationships in terms of a scholarly perspective and organize them and share them, we start to change the field. And so that's really an important part about this process is understanding those linkages between those systems, because we could describe the systems, but if they're not interacting with the other systems, then we don't really have anything. We just have sort of a description, like a view, where if we talk about how they change or influence, then we talk about, something that is important to the field, because that's ultimately what we need to do is change behaviors. And so if we can think about that perspective, the one thing that I wanted to show in this model here is this, this mesosystem. And I skipped over that in my last piece because what's interesting about this is, again, the more that you have in alignment, if we surround that individual, whether that's if we think about the individual as the person who's experienced a level of trauma, and if we align their family and their teachers and their spiritual leaders and their schools and then the community, like if they're all in support of good, mental health or social support, the more influence we have on that individual. But if we have media pulling things away, and we have schools that don't talk about things, and we have parents who don't want to talk about mental health, and we have and they're all disparate, and that mesosystem is not focused, we have lots of opportunities for individuals to go in different directions. And so again, this is just one model that we use within the journal, maybe not so much in our lab called the Resiliency Behaviors Lab, to try to organize our thoughts and how do we help influence change in people's health. And what was unique about Bronfenbrenner's theory is that it happens over time. So whether you're talking about children at a very young age, their relationships with school and teachers and parents is very different than if they're 16 or if they're 50. And so again, as you're thinking about your relationships and who you're working with in your parts of the world, maybe your chronos system, is specific towards adolescents or parents or geriatric. So I just want you to sort of open your mindset to what we can talk about in the journal. And so here is just a construct of, some of the things that might be influential in a person's world. So you have the individual and you have their genetics and their attitudes and their competencies and their health. But it also goes to, are they living in a war situation or a famine situation or a migrant situation or an urban situation or rural? Like that influences the person themselves. I was trying to find my highlighter here. But, so you got the individual and then you got the people around them. So we can write and talk and think about how these people influence the individuals and vice versa. And then going back to your, family and family, friends of family and neighbors and social systems, media, and how they influence. So again, we have great opportunities to pick small examples of these and go in and learn about them and then share that. So we don't have to have the answer to change the world in one manuscript. The process of scholarship is for us to take a small piece, to be really ideally specific about it, and then to be able to generalize that to the larger population. And so we can change, again, the practice of our field. So any questions on that model, or is that helpful in thinking about the opportunities that you might have?
Yes. We use it, right? In planning the interventions. But it's
Okay.
I think the arrows are very meaningful to discuss probably at a point, because this is kind of the issue. I mean, when I do something, how much time does it take to do the change, and
Mhm.
how is this impacting the different layers of the community, for instance, or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and again, it goes the other way. So if you have
Yeah.
an incident where many people, from an earthquake or an event of some sort, how much time does that take to influence the support that gets back to them, right? So especially if they're in areas that are remote or in a culture that maybe doesn't support mental health effectively. So yeah, good. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the process that happens within the journal. Has everybody had a chance to look at the journal's website?
Yeah.
Okay. So so on that, in the top bar, you have a whole bunch of stuff about the about section. And so we do have um, some history to it. And in short, in 2005, we started working on international guidelines for first aid. And we did that with the ILCOR process, which is the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation. And they basically said, does first aid work? And I think we had no idea. Like everybody says, well, it should work, but we actually had no hard evidence to suggest that it actually did. And so the question came then to, well, what is first aid? And, who does it? What did they do it with? When is it done? When does it stop? And so over the next 5 years, we started to answer some of those questions, and we started to put out some guidelines with that. And one of the pieces that we talked about was this chain of survival behaviors. And so when we talk about first aid, and so this is specific to our journal, each of these is a domain of learning, meaning you would teach in a different way each of those domains, but you also have to link them together. And if you're going to have a comprehensive first aid course, then you would have all of these domains represented in some level. And so the idea was then to, okay, so what does prevent and prepare mean in first aid? And so, we looked at, what are those human resources or physical resources that are available to respond to an acute injury or illness? And just thinking about, what can we do? What can we have in place ready to go when something happens? And then once something happens, and can somebody recognize that it's happened? And so it's really easy to sort of see blood, but it's much harder to see some of those signs or those symptoms of trauma on the mental health side of things. And how do we distinguish between those different illnesses or injuries? And so that's the early recognition piece. So if you're going to recognize it, then you probably should do something about it. And that's where first aid can happen. And that first aid is to help reduce the level of trauma. So how do you take that bandage and put it on to stop the bleeding so there's more blood inside the system? Or in our case of psychosocial or mental health support, how do we help take them out of the environment that's stressing them? And we need to recognize some level of limitations because we can't stop all bleeding and we can't stop all mental trauma. So how do we access help? And how do they do that? Where do they do that? And that comes into a lot of the networking pieces that you've been building. So that accessing help is a different piece. And both first aid and accessing help can happen at the same time, but they might have different competencies on how you do them. And then the last piece of the chain of survival behaviors is what do we do afterwards? And so there's a level of self-recovery, both for the responder and for the person who's been traumatized. So I think of this in terms of how do we get back to health? So if you play sports and you twisted your ankle, you don't necessarily have to go to the hospital. You could be at home and you could do certain things. You could put ice on for 20 minutes, take it off for 20 minutes. You can do that for several days, and that's going to help your recovery. So that's self-recovery. But again, we have maybe issues that require advanced care. So how do we get them to a facility or to emergency medical services to get them to a facility where advanced care takes over and supports them? And so that's sort of our stretch, our scope of the journal. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. I'd sort of like to stop there for just a minute and ask if anybody on the call has put together a pitch yet. That it was when we sent out the slides earlier. Did anybody actually put one together? No? Okay. All right. So that's going to shorten our meeting a little bit. I was hoping that people would build something and we'd have a chance to talk about it. But just thinking about this chain of survival behaviors, where do you see some of your work, where your big ideas fitting into this chain, and in which domain? And I can put them back up if that's helpful.
Yeah, could you put it back up, please, Jeffrey?
Sure.
I would second that. Yeah.
Jeffrey, hi. My name is Ganna, and I apologize for being late, and so sorry to miss the first introduction. I'm one of the technical advisors in the team. In instant looking at the circles and the chains, I was thinking about the concept that we use a lot is resilience and psychological resilience. And technically, where would you put it? Because to me, it's basically it's kind of closing the loop. It can be in the prevention and preparedness, but also for sure there's a lot on post-traumatic growth and then connected to recovery and building strength.
So I would encourage you to think about resilience not as a thing, right? But if it's an organizing concept. So you can talk about resiliency in an introduction and say, this is what, if you're resilient, this is what happens. Okay. Right? You can sort of give that, but what you're trying to share maybe with the community, with other people doing this work, is a certain part of resiliency. Okay. So yours might be, so in order to have, and I'm just making this up, and I'm an extrovert, so I do this. So if you think about if a community has a strong network of people who are trained and you're building that training, you're really in that prevent and prepare
Yeah.
domain. And that's what you're, when you write your manuscript, you start out like, well, we want to build resiliency. And to do that, we're going to have to start with this prevent and prepare. And we get more specific to what you're doing to building that. Other people might be working on resiliency from that first aid behaviors. So they're training people who are going to be, right after the earthquake or in the migrant camp or after the shooting, and they're trying to talk very specifically about what specific helping behaviors, which are going to help resiliency overall, but they're going to focus in on that domain. So you can think about resiliency in terms of this larger, I'm going to try to slide back. If you think about it in terms of, if you think about resiliency in this macro system, that's what you're trying to build. Then how do you get more specific as you come in towards the individual? So, yeah, so I think resiliency is an awesome organizing concept, but you can't do everything at the same time.
Yeah.
Josh?
Thank you.
First of all, hi Ghana. It's been a while. I haven't seen many of the faces here in a while since I was on leave. If I was to brainstorm out loud as well as an extrovert, I think there's two things that come to mind. One is maybe assumption is a strong word, but the focus of first aid on the immediate person directly, physically, or medically at risk. But I think if we're taking Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model a bit more seriously and apply it in a first aid situation, it's the friends, the family members, the people that have emotional proximity, physical proximity to the person. So I think going beyond first aid, where focus is on the individual in medical needs, it's the people around them too that ensure kind of long-term results. I would assume that if a person who had a heart attack and was being resuscitated or receiving CPR, if their daughter, if their friend, if their family member is around them and is in so much emotional distress, doesn't receive some kind of psychological support, their ability to make critical decisions for the care of their loved one, even after first aid, I would assume, I don't have evidence, but I would assume the results would be that people who receive psychological first aid around that person who need the first aid to begin with, it would help not just the secondary people who are affected, but also the direct recipient of first aid. So that would be kind of a hypothesis I would put forward. And I think psychological first aid also helps with triage. It's to get people to calm down, to be able to find what they need. And once again, it might not be the person directly in need of first aid, but it's the helpers involved. It's the crowd around, the bystanders who can then be active participants in helping. So from a purely pragmatic point of view, when there's people panicking next to the person who needs the first aid, probably the results are poorer than if they were calmed and help in the survival behaviors. So those are two thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah. So just in response to that, you notice that the links sort of go around in a circle.
Yeah.
So because,
absolutely.
A person who has a traumatic event happen, like they're more apt to have an experience of that in the future, right? So psychologically. So yeah, so how do we help people who were around them? And we do this with epileptics, we do this with diabetics, we do this with people with heart disease. I mean, how do we train the family and bystanders that are around them, their coworkers and those, to be of support and to recognize it? And what we find out is that then they're more responsive to other people in the community and their families and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's a real nice chain in that sense. And you hit a number of those domains, from that early recognition and piece. And you got very specific, which is great as you're thinking about a manuscript, is what can these people do? What are some of their limitations? what are some of our limitations in our training, in helping people be calm or recognize the influence of bystanders. And what do we do to make the scene safe? And that scene safety is an important part in lots of different first aid situations. So great. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Other ideas?
I have one just to maybe also just jump in a little bit. We talked a little bit about in the beginning when we started this partnership with you guys, Jeff, and the PS Center, of the integration between psychological first aid and first aid. And even in the way that you were speaking, like you mentioned, like first aid doesn't prohibit you from accessing help as well. I mean, it goes the same with the look, listen, and link principles that we work with IJFAE or psychological first aid. But I think for me, it's an interesting aspect is the self-recovery aspect, the last bubble, return to health of all involved. And maybe having an approach as in duty of care or, responsible employment, or basically the helpers, and what can you do to ensure that they also have the capacity to work through what they have experienced or the support that they have given. Because again, as you said, and with the example Josh just gave, really good at helping others, really good at following the standard procedures of support to others around you, but the whole self-recovery is something that gets bypassed quite a bit.
We have a wonderful colleague in the Peel region of it's right outside of Toronto. If you think about the Toronto airport, if you've ever been through there, that's the region of Peel. And he runs a program where for every cardiac arrest, he goes through and he downloads all the AED information, he talks to witnesses, and then he goes back within 24 hours and talks to everybody and debriefs their experience on the psychological side and the physical side, because often, things don't, it's ugly. I mean, first aid or resuscitation processes aren't pretty. So they've had some stress with that. They don't know the outcomes. They don't know if what they did was helpful or not helpful or harmful even. And so that process has been published a couple of times now. And it's really led to a lot of, I think, saving graces for people who've been on that. I was there. I didn't push on their chest, but I watched them throw up, or I helped get the ambulance there. So it's not, they didn't do the CPR or whatever that we think like first responders do, but they were there and they needed that support afterwards. So so there's some good stuff.
And I think also just to round it out a little bit, the whole integration of psychological first aid and first aid, the app that we talked about from the IFRC, the first aid app that we helped or co-developed them with, or gave the module on PFA to, was something new. So it was an update. So now there is a component of PFA in that app as well, just to show that you can't separate first aid and psychological first aid from one another. Because the resuscitation and the approach and the aftercare that the helpers might need, that's one thing. But there's also coming to a scene where it's not an open wound or somebody who needs resuscitation, but who needs psychological first aid. And there's a hesitancy and a fear of doing more harm and not really having those skills in those situations. Is why we see the need to introduce this as a whole package of first aid, physical and mental.
And so and again, from a scholarly perspective, how much can we teach in one first aid course, right? Can we teach everything? And, because this is really a way of life. When we're talking about resiliency, we're talking about communities that are, have support through many different pieces. We don't rely on one person to do everything. But how do we help people be aware of, in that early recognition piece that something is wrong? A person's thinking about hurting themselves, people are thinking they can't participate, whatever that might be, like those early cues, and they might not have all the tools to do stuff with, but how do we get them to be able to access help even, at that first level? When we talk about levels of evidence, have you ever heard of the Kirkpatrick scale?
The Kirkpatrick?
Kirkpatrick. So it basically starts with people's self-assessment and their attitudes. And in psychology, there's a million attitude scales, right? We have one for CPR, one for, people willing to help stop bleeding. And so, do they feel confident? This is the theory of planned behavior type of stuff. So, are they thinking about that? But then on the Kirkpatrick scale, that's sort of at the lowest level. The next level would be, do they have the skills to actually do something? And so can we measure their abilities to identify, explain, connect different concepts around psychological first aid? And then the sort of the top scale of, or the sort of top tier scholarship, I think, of Kirkpatrick is around them demonstrating those skills. So not only do they know it, but can they actually do something about it? So think about how you have scenarios, can they dialogue with somebody, or can they make the actual, pick the right resources for that person to use or to help them. So we can report on any of those levels, but the higher you get in the Kirkpatrick scale, the more robust of the study that's going to take it. So again, from a scholarly perspective, you could measure any of those and report on them. But as you think about your scholarly process, maybe working up towards that higher level is going to benefit the community. So. Any other ideas? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the journal in terms of what, sort of we do. So it is a peer-reviewed open access journal, and it is free to publish in, and it's free to read because of our volunteers. And that's really important because our volunteers are there because they're learning while they do it. All of our editors, our editorial board are learning about this at the same time that we're working to share it. And so what we want to share, though, is the knowledge and the practices involved with first aid and first aid education. And so that's to improve and increase the actions taken by people. And that people could be the parents, it could be the schools, it could be the lawmakers, it could be spiritual leaders, again, thinking about Bronfenbrenner, all those people have the opportunity to take action to help people in emergencies. Some of it's more indirect and some of it's more direct as you get closer. But it's really about that evidence base, like creating that evidence base and having that strong social and public policy part of it too. So, Daniel, did you want to add anything into this conversation?
I think you're doing an excellent job. Yeah, I think one of the important things is because I know it's kind of almost like a theory dump. But what I will say is thinking about the context in which you want to frame it is maybe one of the most important. For example, my master's degree really touched on how curriculum in terms of first aid education surrounds and encompasses the students, teachers, staff across Canada in their segregated jurisdictions. So, there's quite a few provinces and territories in Canada. It's all done provincially in terms of curriculum. And so working through that Bronfenbrenner's chrono system, we start off with, those jurisdictions, then come down, like who's involved in that, kind of more so ministerially or like politically, then come down a little bit more. Who are the advocates, the superintendents, the kind of administrative staff, to then make sure that the teachers are kind of at what level, ensuring that this stuff is being carried out, taught to students, taught to teachers even, and then more that individual level where it is the teacher and or the student. So even maybe visually trying to plan things out rather than even kind of like right dumping all the ideas right off the bat. tends to help with me. That's probably going to be my biggest suggestion. That and I just like drawing. Sometimes it's a nice break from writing and reading and everything else. So yeah, just trying to contextualize it, I think might be a really solid starting point, especially for all of this as you take it in.
Yeah. So as you're thinking about your pitch, you know, what specifically do you think you can improve or increase for people to take action with? Just so we have a little bit more conversation.
Is that for the group or was
It's
that
for
for
the
me?
group, yeah, for the group.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are you doing? What are you seeing in the field that needs to be improved or is improving based on the work that you're doing?
That's an existential question.
You're very
It is pretty existential, actually.
So Jeffrey,
Yeah.
you're not only extrovert, but also you are very optimist.
It's all opportunities.
Josh, you have your hand up?
Josh is also very optimist.
Yeah.
I'm definitely an optimist. I think if I were to speak on behalf of the project that Arskana and I have been working a lot on, focusing here in Europe, I think we saw the evolution of a 3-year project starting from a very acute phase, focusing on psychological first aid as a kind of narrow scope, as a thing you do, and then expanding to more of a concept, organizing structure, as you said, Jeffrey. It's incredibly diverse because we have 25 countries in the project. But I think if I were to optimistically say something that I have seen change in the time that I've been with the PS Center since September, is seeing that the method of delivering psychological support and first aid can transition the structure and framework of PFA can still be applicable after the acute phase, but the way it's delivered changes, and that's borrowing from Bronfenbrenner's structure. We had large discussions about what does it mean to shift with the context from a acute phase to a more protracted situation where the needs are still there, but the modality is tailored for an acute response. But I think the whole idea of you look and you listen, and then you see what you do afterwards is still very much applicable at any point.
Yeah.
But it's thinking, how do we do that? So I think the PFA as an organizing framework for basic response, even after an acute phase of a large migration crisis, as we've seen, and still ongoing, I'd say has been very encouraging. And I think has improved some of the maturity and knowledge of the countries we're supporting to think beyond just this narrow scope.
Right.
Maybe
I think that's yeah. I'm just going to bounce off of that again because we're extroverts, Josh. You know, if I see that happening here, or I'm not in Canada, but I work with Canada quite a bit. You know, after a wildfire, and so we have had communities that are wiped out. And that acute phase of that first couple of days is there, but then who's there the next 6 months, 9 months, years around the psychological support and the challenges that go with it. So I totally think that's a problem, and so that's a good problem to identify. You have an organizing theory around, you know, psychological first aid, and then your specific piece around what's that transition from an acute to a long-term or chronic, you know, piece is really interesting. And so you may have, in your experience with 25 countries, 6 countries that have managed that. And so you have 6 case studies to report on and link to make a case series, which is a very academically appropriate type of manuscript. So you can see how you went from this problem, you had a concept, and then you see how it's materialized, and then we get to learn from it. So I think that's a nice start of a pitch. How about other people?
I have a question, or maybe a comment. We do look at psychological first aid as less as an intervention as compared to the first aid, right? It's a protocolized sequence of actions in the context, but more like a set of skills. And I think that's the set of skills that enables, which is applicable in various contexts. And sometimes we internally joke around and say, we're teaching humans to be humans again, right? It's like how to listen actively, how to not to give advice, how to not allow your judgment impact and make the situation even more difficult to discriminate. And this is something that actually matters. So that there is an element to that. So how we transfer from IJFAE as an intervention to a set of skills, which is cross-cutting and has relevance regardless where you operate.
Yeah, I think that's interesting conceptually for me in that, so I travel the world and I learn about first aid and how people do it. And I was in China probably 5 years ago, and they showed me their first aid manual, and it was thick, and it had every way to tie a bandage, like how many turns you have, and how wide the bandage is, and it was very specific, and they taught it over 24 hours. Like it was a long first aid course, which was very different than what we do in the United States, which is where we're trying to simplify the skills and say, here's your objective, do it, right? So if you only need to put your hand on it to stop the bleeding, then you've accomplished your goal. You stop the bleeding, as opposed to learning how to tie and twist the bandage to make it put pressure on. And so there's this tension in the field around how many skill levels are there to be effective, and what can you teach it then before people are overwhelmed and their confidence goes down to be able to do it. And so there's a really interesting tension that could be played out around psychological first aid too. Like, if we say everybody has to be trained for 24 hours in psychological first aid, we're going to have a lot less people trained than if we said, take this 1 hour of training and learn the principles and do it. But I'm sure there's a medium in there. And so if you have experiences in the different countries that have an 8-hour course and a 1-hour course or an online course, and you can look at the outcomes, you would be able to contribute then to that conversation about what might be appropriate.
Yeah.
So, but I still, and this would be maybe a question of leadership from the center. Do you all agree what the competencies are of psychological first aid? And when I say competencies, I'm talking about skills, knowledge, and attitudes. So if you were to be trained in psychological first aid, you would have this checklist of things to do so that other people, when they're developing courses in Lebanon versus Brazil, they know the competencies they need to meet, but because they're in a slightly different culture, maybe they do it a different way, but they still meet the competency. It's just a different skill on how to get there. But do we even have agreement on that? And I don't know. And so I've invited Sarah Kate also to think about this too, is do you as a center have a position, an evidence-based position around this topic that could be an organizing manuscript for the special issue? Then you individually might write manuscripts that describe a component of that from a different region of the world or a different domain of the chain. So I think there are definitely some opportunities.
Just elaborate on that, and maybe again your perceptions. It's interesting to have. Even today we had a conversation. Like first aid course is certified, right? You get a certificate. And there are a lot of discussions about how do we certify or not certified psychological first aid, because that should be something measurable. And as of now, it is not.
It is.
Because exactly we are talking about this. It's not even. It's not. It's kind of beyond soft skills. It's what it falls under the category people skills. It's the interaction with another that can be done in a harmful or a supportive way. And so that's one note. So there is this debate on certified or not certified. And the second one is that we actually, there is a base of evidence that the approach to training and components is the same, regardless. Then we need to take into consideration the cultural adaptation of things.
Yeah.
And again, with all of the international humanitarian work, we cannot be coming in and trying to use the same methods. But that would not be about teaching the competence. Competence and knowledge would be the same. It's that cultural lens element to it.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're aware that the Global First Aid Reference Center, GFARC, has an international attestation process for first aid. So essentially, so they've laid out the minimum criterias of what a first aid course needs to have, and it mirrors the chain of survival behaviors. It uses the guidelines, the international first aid guidelines, and then that country says to GFARC, we believe we meet this minimum level, and then they submit evidence for that, and then we go observe it, and then they get a stamp that they can put on their psychological first aid course or first aid course that says, yes, this meets the minimum standards. And so if they were to go between Nicaragua and Panama, they could, that certification would be the same. If both countries agreed to it. So I think there is a process, and that again is something that could be worked on through the center, but could be published, as sort of guidelines. Here are the guidelines of psychological first aid. And it's not saying how to do it, or you only can do it this way, but here are the guidelines for your country to work with so you can develop your course. And it's evidence-based because, two of you looked at the, what goes into a resource kit, or what goes into asking non-threatening questions, or whatever that might be. And you've organized the literature that exists in a way to make evidence-based recommendations. But that's a whole nother process that we'd invite you into, maybe not as the journal, but as a reference center for contributing to the guidelines. So,
do you want to say something, Patricia?
It's just that when one colleague we work with, Rebecca Horn, she already have studied on the length of a PFA and how evidence-based it is, if it's 1 day, more than 1 day, or 3 days. And there is also a review of evidence related to PFA.
Has that been published?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So those are great references for your manuscript if you want to relate it back. So whenever you're writing an academic manuscript, you need to connect it back to the literature. So
I think also with Sarah Cade's study on PFA, that's the one that she's mentioned a couple of times, would be one for that she would submit for this here. And just also to echo what Gano was saying in terms of certification and everything on how you actually measure it with PFA, I always think about mirroring it with first aid as well, because we have mandatory refresher courses for first aid. So there should be an equal element of that when it comes to psychological first aid, and it not being a one-off. And then also when interacting with other countries and we call them national societies here, is also to not provide a golden standard of approach, because that's really how we have shorthanded ourselves in the reach, and also how adopting the skills, because basically if you do that, there's no room for contextualizing, and we wouldn't know how a culture would work most properly.
Yeah, and so that's where we don't write like an ideal first aid course. We say, here are the elements that need to be within that first aid course. And if you want to do this using, you know, things that you find in your home versus a first aid kit versus an ambulance, that's your choice as a country, because you might not have those resources. Or in some cases, we say, you know, having an AED, an automated external defibrillator, is important, and you should go over those skills. But frankly, in some countries, there's not an EMS system where if you put, you hooked up an AED, there's no place for them to go. So again, they get to choose how they want to implement it, but they have to have an element around cardiac arrest, but they might use different tools. So, yeah.
I had just one, it was just a half pitch kind of thing, but one thing that I was, and it's a little different than the two other ideas that were brought up. So I'm the focal point for the African region, and in my position in that capacity here, one of the things that I've noticed is a lot around the narrative, and the narrative around capacities, and what capacities there might be. We're talking about a whole continent in this regard. And the feedback that I'm getting and what I'm noticing is that there's not an acknowledgement of existing capacities when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support in the national societies there. It is more an emergency happens or something happens where support is needed, and the support has to come from outside. And there's not so much an acknowledgement of what is already existing, or more so what has already been done and has been done years before, which is MHPSS or PFA or community-based, whatever that it might be. And for me, it would be interesting to utilize the platform of the journal to shine a light a little bit on that. How do we talk about capacities and the lack of acknowledgement of existing capacities that are already there? It might be a little off kilter, I'm not sure, but I still lean on the social and I lost my word, but it was linked to the chain of survival, because it is a sort of behavior, and it's also a sort of perpetuating a narrative that has been there for quite some time within this field.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, so we could have a nice scholarly piece where we have evidence and we make recommendations from that because of it, whether those are from case studies, those are from surveys, those are from measuring the number of people who are accessing help, those types of things. So we could do that very researchy perspective. We can also describe a problem if we, and in this case, it might be, how do we identify local or cultural supporters of support, right? In this particular region. And so you can call that out in a descriptive manuscript, like, here's the problem, this is why we see it as a problem, and then think about, well, what could be some potential answers for that without providing the answers. And so that's a descriptive manuscript. And that could be helpful again for that next reader who goes, wait a second, in Canada, we acknowledge the First Nations that are here, and we work with in the US, we would maybe call them tribal leaders and the elders, and who are not certified in first aid, they're not psychological first aid, but that collective wisdom of having gone through many adversities is helpful. And so they might write about that from a case study, which then might lead to another case study and a series. And so the line of scholarship emerges based on identifying the problem, starting to think about the solutions, coming to, create the evidence then. So, yeah, so I think that's a great thing. how do you document it from your experience? To that, is it just you who thinks it? How many other people think about it? How does it cross from, I don't know if you only do sub-Saharan Africa, or how does it go into the MENA region? So there's lots of ways you could look at it, but you need to focus it and get to a point that's helpful for other people to think about it in a certain way. So.
And also maybe be very explicit if like which areas of the continent, is it East Africa, is it Sub-Saharan, is it Southern, and then that would be the starting point for that conversation.
In honesty, having worked with Africans in a many times, you don't want to say Africa as one thing, right?
No, it's not a country.
Yeah,
it's not a country.
Right.
It's not.
So
Africa,
so how do we pick an East or a West or something? So how do we do that? So Daniel, I think we have just a few more minutes, but could you sort of go through this framework that we talked about earlier, this emerging scholars, and sort of what the big idea is and stuff like that? And then I'll pick up and just talk about the journal itself.
Sure, of course. So we do have kind of a new, renewed section within the International Journal of First Aid Education. Is the Emerging Scholars segment, where we do try help support emerging scholars come to light in terms of publications, manuscript creation, editing support, review, etc. Especially in the framing of the chain of survival behaviors. And so what's really interesting is I'm a PhD student, actually just started my comprehensive examination today. So super fun. Can't wait to finish that. But started that today. And at McGill University, more so in the neuro section, which does remain relevant as well with the PS Center, they did have a framework in order to help with publications and have a publishing timeline, which I found was really unique. So after kind of investigating that a little bit, I decided, well, what if we were able to make it a little more pragmatic, or maybe a little more ease of access, ease of time, ease of accessibility, and modify it for the context of publishing in the International Journal of First Aid Education. So in alignment with the chain of survival behaviors, which actually kind of mirrors those bubbles, which is the visual I kind of wanted, maybe just in a little bit of contrast, I kind of reformatted and re-rigged it so that way it's a little more visually pleasing, but also kind of, I would say, originally abstract, but on purpose. So I don't have can I access laser pointer? I don't think I can, but we'll start off with the exclamation document. You can just even like hover around it. So yeah, that one right there. So that little exclamation document, re-rigged a couple and a few of these images as well, so that way it fits better with the context of the chain of survival behavior. So that big exclamation mark is our idea. What's the idea that we have? What do we want to put down on paper? Could be a research problem, could be a differentiation between our methods used to teach individuals PFA or mental health first aid in terms of different context areas, or even disciplinary realms. How do we want to fit it? If we do with first aid, just some kind of shots in the dark there, but they're never really shots in the dark. And we want to try and really kind of emulate that, at least either on paper, into words, into some sort of structure to start off. Then we got to think, we'll go to the upload. Perfect. Who's going to be downloading this? So who's our target audience? Who do we want to read it? Who is it for? Could be for practitioners, could be for additional scholars, those of which who can take this knowledge to themselves and use it to either revitalize their own work or use it as evidence-based progression in some sort. And then we move down, and how are we then formulating this knowledge? With which and what methodologies, frameworks. So in terms of theoretical frameworks, Bronfenbrenner's can work well in a multitude of areas, which is, I'm sure, why Jeffrey picked it. Plus, I'm sure it's also maybe one of his favorites, at least fundamentally. I can attest to that. I'm an educator. We talk about Bronfenbrenner's quite often. Another one for myself is Bloom's taxonomy, or Bloom's revised taxonomy, which mirrors well Kirkpatrick's work with those triangles. It seems that academia and scholarly work and everywhere else loves the triangles. Those pyramids or triangles are just everywhere, as well as these circles visuals. But I'd say the key here is, how are we going to frame our knowledge, our work, our investigation together, so that way it's kind of can be unified in more of scholarly areas or disciplines. And so one thing I mentioned prior in a different call is Bronfenbrenner's work might be similar to an artist's, like Van Gogh's. Like, we see that there's a painting, which is the Manuscript, and Van Gogh would have, you know, his own touch, his own style of painting. And then you'd have a different one, which would be Bloom's revised taxonomy. That could be Picasso painting. So people can kind of tell what the different styles are in terms of how to theoretically frame it, using whether it's quantitative or qualitative work, but they work nicely together. And then our big red cross there, that one I had to go with, you know, something that's universally recognized, and that is, how does it fit within the chain of survival behavior? So then we align it more with the International Journal of First Aid Education. And then once we see that it aligns, we submit it to the journal. Then after that,
Yeah, I can help with that.
Yeah. So
So-
from there,
Yeah. So again, what we're trying to get you to do in this sort of area here is make a pitch for yourselves, for your bosses, and if you want to, you know, actually send it in to us, we'd be happy to give you some support. So, you know, making sure you have a take-home message in this pitch, knowing your readers, understanding the validity of what you're saying, because if it's just your idea, that's great, but turning it as a letter to the editor. If it's something that you actually have some support for, that's going to help us. So to understand your own methods and pieces like that, and then the impact. So the publication process for the journal, it's all online. You submit it with metadata, meaning the author's names, your contact information, your abstract. You have an ethics statement you have to put in if you involve human subjects. There's also a great, and I don't know how many people know about this, it's called the equatornetwork.org, and they're called reporting guidelines. So if you did an experiment, you did a systematic review, you have case studies, there are sort of minimum expectations of what you put into your academic paper, your manuscript, so that we can compare manuscripts when we start to do guidelines processes, or academics can look between and find the same information between different articles. And so please, you know, go to there, look up the kind of study that you did or the kind of report that you're doing, and make sure you have each of those elements in there. It tells you what needs to go in the manuscript, or the abstract, the different headings for the manuscript, what you need to talk about in terms of measurement tools and things like that. After you turn that in, it comes into the editor's team, where two of us basically flag, is it within the scope of the journal or not in the scope of the journal? And if it's outside of the scope, we say, thank you, but maybe here's a journal that might want to, you know, print this. If it's within the scope and we think if it's sufficient quality to go forward for peer review, we make that decision there. So then an editor takes it and they will send it out for peer review. We have a minimum of 2 peer reviewers that are obviously associated with the journal, or not the journal, but the manuscript itself. And then they make a determination, you know, is it unique? Does it add to the value of our profession? Is it sufficient quality? And does it meet the author guidelines that we gave? So just sort of perspective. We reject about 18% of all submissions because they don't fall into the scope. We request revisions and a resubmission initially for about 7%. So that basically, like, you got an idea, but you don't have a lot of this information. We accept about 75% of the things that are submitted with revisions. So we ask them after peer review to address certain things, which generally people do, and then it goes to publication. We've had 0, and this is important for people who don't publish a lot. We've had 0% actually submit something ready for publication. Like, it's gone to peer review and peer reviewers are like, yes. We always are there's going to be some level of revision. And so as you're thinking about a timeline on this, once you get that decision, which takes several weeks, because we have to send it out for review, we have to collate the reviews, we have to then send it back to you. We're talking about 6 weeks to maybe 3 months time period from when you submit to it could be published. So if you can think about that timeline, and the more you have it together, the faster it goes. So that goes to that decision. And if you want to see that process, and you don't have to submit anything, but you could log in just to look at it, you could go to the submit an article on the publication process. So, all right, I'm going to end us here because we're at an hour and a half on this. But I did want to say I could stick around for a little bit if people had some questions or ideas they wanted to throw around.
I think it's now we're just the room. Is there anybody who has anything that they were thinking or?
And I think it's more of a question, and I maybe missed it. Do you have the analysis of your audience of how the articles are used? Because we touched on the regional scope. I know that the first aid concept for developed higher income settings.
Yeah.
How this, there will be a growing difference between the realities and
so our readership spans the globe. We have a strong following in Asia, the Asia Pacific region. We have a strong following in Europe. Our probably least amount of downloads are probably South America. Central America seems to pick up on some of the articles, but South America has not been a strong readership for us. And that's also because we haven't worked there specifically. We've had a couple articles from Brazil, Argentina. But we're not getting a lot of readership from there. The types of readers are first aid educators. That's probably a third. The other 2/3 are institutional and first aid training organizations. Not necessarily the Red Cross, but like a St. John Ambulance, lifeguarding associations, those types of groups. So.
Thanks a lot, and I think it's very helpful when and it's also helpful for doing the pitches, how you present the information that you consider relevant, but also make it relevant to the other ones potentially having ideas for their development. Right. And a random connected question: how do you find yourself working with the audience for that amount of time, the connection between first aid and the level of integration of psychological first aid? The perception of it, because that's also one of the challenges, like you mentioned, right? Somehow first aid is more accessible to general public, but psychological first aid sounds still too specialized, too psychological, too clinical, too.
So when I've been doing regional stuff for the International Red Cross for the last several years around trainers of first aid. So these people are sort of have gone through the trainers, they've been trainers of trainers, now they're sort of coordinating it at the national level. We have received zero pushback on the concept of supporting people psychologically. But nobody has said they want to teach a second course, like to say we have to teach them both, because people recognize there's limited opportunities. And so how do you integrate the concept of emergency to be inclusive and not just focus on the stopping the bleeding or whatever? And that's what we've been doing is flipping the concept from this is a clinical issue to being an emergency issue. So really going it from the learner's perspective. So what's going through the victim's mind? What's going through the rescuer's mind? What's going through the bystander's mind? And why do they take actions or not actions? And once you open that up, people are like, oh yeah, we need to talk about the bystander effect, or we need to talk about afterwards, or we need to, and so those situations I think are easily bridged if we could give them those opportunities. Like we can help give them space for it, because in a 24-hour course you can do that. In a 8-hour course you have less, and in a 1-hour course you have even less, right? So how do we help them manage that as practically as probably their challenge?
Thank you.
Yes.
And I think just from my side, on a practical note, of course, there's the call for journals that has gone out that we can all use if we want to submit anything through there. Sarah Kate is utilizing the research network to also broaden it out. But if there's any channels that anybody in the room here think that would be relevant for submitters, please just share those out. And then correct me if I'm wrong, Jeffrey, we said 1st of July with a soft launch at around 1st of September. People can still submit, but we're kind of aiming for the ball to start rolling with submittals
Yes.
1st of July and onwards.
Yes.
And for the PS Center, let me know if there's any questions or to link you up with Jeff or Dan or the team. And then there is also the steps in the invitation, the open call for submittal on how to do it is in there.
Yeah, and if you want to send us your pitch, we'll be happy to give you feedback on it, because again, it's 90 seconds, and then we'll ask you some questions after it, and that could get you there. So,
and is that pitch a recording, like a video or the audio?
Yeah, just in PowerPoint, just turn on the camera and use those 5 slides and give us a pitch. So
definitely. I think we wanted to have done it before the meeting today, but for force majeure reasons. Otherwise,
and just to build on yours for a second, if you're working with a country and they wanted to co-write something with you, that's a great way to have community participatory research. And if they want to share their data and you can help them, you may find that they grow with you. And your next project might be richer from a scholarly perspective with them, if you involve them with this process. It takes more time and energy, but it might also shine the light on other people, which is what if we can expand the network.
I think that's a good idea. And we also all have access to different national societies and communities via our work. I mean, I know Patricia, you as an advisor, help specific countries with specific programming, and some of us, we run communities of practice with our regions, and there's the EU for Health project as well. But
cool. I know in the Americas, I don't know if you have a TA.
We do have a TA. Unfortunately, she's not here today, but we do have one.
We just had a really nice workshop on migrants in the Americas, and the psychological support that's needed for that work. And I think that would be a wonderful piece. And there's GFARC representatives there that could be again a writing partner, perhaps, or they can connect you to the people who are presenting to talk about the level of need or the categories of need of migrants in the Americas, which could easily be contrasted with the European migrants. That are happening, and that would be a really interesting piece. Where you have people maybe leaving from a violent situation versus an economic situation versus people traveling on foot via rail, or could be a lot of different things. So, but
we'll be sure to share this recording with our TA, and GFARC are also familiar with the PS Center after we help co-develop the app. So that would make sense.
Okay.
For sure. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you, Daniel and Jeff, for your time and joining us today. We will share the recording with everybody at the center here, and hope to get a lot of submittals coming in for the special issue. We'll touch base, or I and Sarah Kate will touch base with you bilaterally. And I don't know if anybody has any questions to today.
No. Thank you for being so inspiring and encouraging.
We get our inspiration from you, so thank you for all your work.
Gave us a lot of hope.
Very nice to meet
Awesome.
you.
Very nice. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. Speak to you soon. And thank you so much.
Well. Hope everybody gets healthy.
Stay. Likewise.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Daniel.